The Theory of Flight, Part 2, History, Chapter 2, Beaufort. As Golide Gumede watched the Vickers Viscount travel to the earth as a great ball of fire, he could not have known that retribution would be sought for this one act that made him a hero in the eyes of many, and a villain in the eyes of many others. He understood the madness of war, that there was no rhyme or reason to its casualties, no clear lines between cause and effect. He could not have known that certain men, with a jaundiced sense of justice, would draw an undeviating line from the shooting down of the Vickers Viscount and follow it, like a river, to Beaufort Farm and Estate, where their vengeance would flow like an everlasting stream. But, truth be told, the line reached further still, through Golide Gumede and beyond him, to connect him, in the inexplicable and inextricable ways that only geography can, to Beatrice Beit Beaufort, the heiress of the Beaufort Farm and Estate, and one of the survivors of the downed Vickers Viscount. Two separate lives lived on the same patch of land, brought to such proximity by an idea that had germinated long before Golide and Beatrice came into being, in the mind of one Bennington Beaufort as he sat in his armchair and smoked his pipe, watching the embers of a long unstoked fire slowly die, trying to quiet the disquiet that resided deep in his heart. The lush and verdant village of Guquka became the Beaufort Farm and Estate in much the same way that most villages became settler farms in the colonies. Bennington Beaufort, having had the misfortune of inheriting only the family name and none of its centuries' worth of fortune, dignity, or honor, due to his father's wild speculations, and having had the fortune of, absolutely by chance, distinguishing himself during the Great War, had decided that perhaps a life in the colonies would be just the thing for him. He had always fancied that if he made a go at being a gentleman farmer, he would be a great success at it. He had then set about looking for some land he could acquire through very little effort and at no great expense to himself. There were many colonies to choose from, and so it took quite a few years for him to find the right place. At 100 hectares, the place he settled on, Guquka, was adequate for his needs. Bennington was a fair-minded man, and asked that the Africans who had lived on the land for centuries not be resettled. He had grand schemes for the Beaufort Farm and Estate, schemes that would require a labour force. It was not lost on him that a readily available labour force would be less expensive than a labour force that came from afar. Bennington was a very enterprising man, and he put the land and the people on it to good use. In just 1 decade he had made his farm one of the lifelines of the colony. He grew maize, sugarcane, and cotton, reared cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. He built refineries, butcheries, and mills on his property. He turned the village into a modern compound, replaced the thatched mud rondavels with square concrete rooms under corrugated asbestos sheets. Everyone who lived on the compound worked in some capacity on the farm and estate. And because he was a generous man, he also built a school for the natives on his property. Having thus established himself, Bennington married Rosemary Beit, a woman from the purest pioneer stock who had never quite recovered from the tumble from a horse she had taken when she was a child. Rosemary was considerate enough to die soon after giving birth to a baby girl, Beatrice, thus providing Bennington with an heir, perhaps not of the right gender, but an heir nonetheless. During a trip to the Netherlands with her father, his young daughter had shown a liking for sunflowers, and so Bennington had dedicated a few acres of his land to growing them. When the Second World War broke out, Bennington proved to be indispensable to the war effort. His cotton made the soldiers' uniforms, his canned goods fed the troops, and his leather made it possible to have boots on the ground. He became the wealthiest man in the colony. When he died in an unfortunate car accident in 1948, his only child and heir, Beatrice Beit Beaufort, then became, at 11, the wealthiest person in the colony. At 13, Beatrice went to Everline High School with the distinction of being the daughter of the man most people thought instrumental to the colony's economic growth during and after the war. This guaranteed Beatrice respect and easy passage. However, Beatrice did not make it easy for those willing to grant her any privileges. She was a liberal-minded young woman whose ideas, especially on the rights and treatment of the African, terrified those around her, including Cookie Sedgwick, the girl who was to be her lifelong friend. Beatrice questioned and challenged everything and everyone, whereas Cookie never had an independent thought. Cookie had accepted wholesale the opinions and beliefs of her family, community, and country. She loved her family, she loved her community, and she loved her country, and she never once thought they could be wrong, that they could all have contributed to the establishment and preservation of a system and order that was at its very heart unfair and unjust. Cookie did not quite agree with Beatrice's notions, even thought them foolhardy. But she could not help finding Beatrice's irreverence for all the things that Cookie herself held dear seductive. Not quite brave enough to be as defiant as Beatrice, Cookie was happy just to live vicariously through her and know that an alternative way of thinking and being was possible. For her part, Beatrice never tried to make Cookie share her views. Beatrice was too self-assured, too convinced that her way of thinking was just, correct, and right to look for converts. And because they never tried to change each other and simply accepted one another, Beatrice and Cookie became the best of friends. The only thing that threatened their bond was Emile Coetzee, a man whom Beatrice could never respect, a man whom Cookie loved and later married. After Eveline, Beatrice left for Oxford University and returned 5 years later, perhaps predictably, as a hippie. It was the dawn of the 60s, the age for the Beatrices of the world to finally come into happy being. Never quite comfortable with the grandness of her inheritance, Beatrice turned the Beaufort estate into a multiracial commune and artists' colony. She left the running of the Beaufort farm to the foreman and did not seem to care either way whether he did a good job or not. But Emile Coetzee, Cookie's husband, did care about the Beaufort farm and estate and how it was run. As head of the Organization of Domestic Affairs, he found enough incriminating evidence of interracial commingling to bring a charge of unlawful conduct against all those who lived on the estate. Although equally appalled by the goings-on, the state was, however, hesitant to make them public and extremely reluctant to get on the wrong side of Beatrice Byte Beaufort, who was still the wealthiest person in the country and whose farm was still vital to the nation, especially now that it seemed to be gearing up for a civil war. In 1965, however, when Beatrice Byte Beaufort proudly gave birth to 2 colored twin boys, thereby flouting the state's anti-miscegenation laws, the state decided that she was not to be trusted. Beatrice and her guests were evicted for unlawful behavior and for being unfit residents. When the war ceased to be a few skirmishes here and there and broke out in earnest, becoming a full-blown guerrilla war, Beatrice Byte Beaufort enthusiastically, vocally, and publicly supported the terrorists, African nationalists as she called them, and believed, as they did, that the majority should rule. When Emile Coetzee found out that Beatrice was financially supporting the nationalists, whose military wing was conducting terrorist attacks across the country, he zealously and triumphantly brought charges of treason against her. Beatrice had been vacationing at Victoria Falls with her 2 sons when she received the summons to appear before court. On her way back, tragedy struck. The aeroplane she was travelling in, the Vickers Viscount, was shot down by Golide Gumede. Many died. Beatrice's twin sons died. The policeman escorting Beatrice died. The air hostess, who at that very moment had been serving Beatrice a Malawi shandy, died. But Beatrice survived. Her belief in an equal society also survived. There was such an outpouring of public sympathy for Beatrice Byte Beaufort that the treason charges were dropped and the trial dismissed. Emile Coetzee accepted this turn of events. This was not because he had forgiven Beatrice her past transgressions. It was because he had found another use for her. He used her tragedy to call for the imprisonment and execution of Golide Gumede. Daily images of the smouldering remains of the Vickers Viscount quickly turned public sympathy into public outrage and anger against Golide Gumede. The public soon joined Emil Coetzee in thirsting for Golide Gomere's blood, and Emil Coetzee promised to have his head on a platter within 3 days. However, finding Golide Gomere did not prove to be easy. Although there were many reports of people having seen him, everyone had a different description of him. He was tall, he was short, he was heavy-set, he was thin, he was handsome, he had the type of face only a mother could love, he was an African, he was white. And no one knew what his name had been before the war. When Golide Gomere proved elusive and thus impossible to capture, Emil turned to his most trusted man, Mordecai. Mordecai Gatiro had grown up in Makogoba Township, not knowing who his parents were or had been. The township was rough, and because he was a part of it, he was rough as well. He lived in an orphanage where he was bullied by the older children and where he looked forward to bullying the younger children when he was older. He was an angry child, and really, there was no alternative emotion for him to feel. He ended up, unsurprisingly, in a reform school that was one of even more hard knocks than the orphanage. Along the way, he adamantly refused to acquire a skill or get an education. He, and everyone who knew him, knew that he would die young because his was a life born of fire. He was always getting into fights, dangerous fights, with fists, knives, and guns involved. But he did not die. Frustrated with living, he joined the war. He was a freedom fighter or a terrorist. You could think of him whichever way you wanted. He did not care. He was captured, and this made him happy because he thought for sure he would hang for treason. Emil Coetzee, however, had other plans for him. He turned Mordecai into a spy, which was easy enough since Mordecai had never learned to have allegiances. He hoped he would get caught and killed, but that did not happen either. Instead, Emil Coetzee noticed a rare quality in Mordecai that made him officially employ him as a member of the organization. For not only did Mordecai not care much for his own life, he did not care much for the lives of others either. Because of this, Mordecai became the organization's best interrogator. He was so valuable to Emil Coetzee that his name was never recorded, even within the organization's files. Mordecai was simply known as C10. It was through the unrelenting efforts of C10 that the organization knew, months after Emil had promised the head of Golide Gomere to the public, that Golide Gomere, born Livingston Stanley Tikiti, had a sister, Menenhle Tikiti, who lived on the Beaufort farm and estate. And that is how Mordecai's and Menenhle's destinies became intertwined. Menenhle Tikiti was picked up and processed by the organization on September 24th, 1978. But even though C10 was at his most persuasive, in a dark room, working and walking stealthily, attacking her from all sides, alternating gentle words with brute force, coming at her with a lit cigarette, a wielded knife, a heel of a boot, burning, cutting, and crushing, secure in the knowledge that she could not see his face, Menenhle never gave up her brother. Nor did she give herself up, unlike most people who usually offered up something, usually rather quickly, during their encounter with C10. A name, a story, true or false, a long-held dignity, an ingrained sense of self. Menenhle gave up nothing. After days of torture, it was Mordecai who, in the exchange, gave up something, his desire to die. He had found in Menenhle Tikiti a new purpose in life. He had finally found something, someone, to have an allegiance to. He would dedicate the rest of his life to undoing the pain he had caused her. It took Mordecai years to prepare himself for Menenhle. He left his job at the organization, which was easy since Emil Coetzee had been greatly disappointed by his failure, and took a job at the National Archives, repairing and restoring books and manuscripts, mending spines and fixing tears with great gentleness and care. He even changed his voice, making it more sing-songy. It was only when he was certain that she would not recognize him that he re-entered Menenhle Tikiti's life and never left it. Mordecai arrived at the Beaufort farm and estate on a Mackenzie bus one unassuming Wednesday afternoon and departed 2 weeks later with Menenhle. They climbed aboard the Mackenzie bus and, As Mordecai paid the bus conductor, Menenhle looked up at the sky and marveled at its independent blueness. The Mackenzie bus that Menenhle and Mordecai took in 1983 was the very same bus Thandi Hadebe had taken on the day she escaped from the Beaufort farm and estate in 1974. Thandi Hadebe was born on the Beaufort farm and estate. Her father was the Beaufort school's messenger boy and caretaker, a job that allowed her family to live a comfortable life. Their housing was provided, and they received substantial monthly rations. Both her parents were very Christian and very proper. They raised their daughter to stand out and be an example. Thandi had known all her life that she was beautiful because almost everyone who saw her said so. At first she did not think much of her own beauty. She took it for granted. But as she grew older, she realized that her beauty afforded her a certain kind of ease, a certain kind of power. She never had to struggle. She made friends easily. Teachers tended to favor her. She got special attention, and eventually she stopped trying to prove herself. She stopped trying to be anything more than what people saw. And then, in Thandi's 16th year, Menenhle Tekiti entered her life as her domestic science teacher. Menenhle was not charmed by Thandi. She was not taken with her beauty. She pushed Thandi to have greater ambition in life than just being a pretty face. Thandi suspected that Menenhle, who had no beauty to speak of, was secretly jealous of her, and so she did not take Menenhle seriously, until the day the Sojas came to the Beaufort farm and estate. The Sojas entered Menenhle's class while it was in session. The girls were busy making pretty dresses. One of the Sojas asked the girls to strip naked and put on their pretty dresses. Because it was a preposterous thing to say, and because he sounded as though he was merely joking, most of the girls giggled. The Soja made his request again, his tone more serious this time. The girls who giggled this time did so nervously and uncertainly. The Soja made his request yet again, and, to do away with any confusion on the girls' part, he shot 2 bullets from his pistol into the ceiling. The girls, trembling, stripped naked and put on their half-made pretty dresses. Some of them cried silent tears. Then the Soja asked Menenhle to choose who was the prettiest of them all. For the first time in her life, Thandi did not want to be the prettiest girl. She did not want to be pretty at all. Her eyes pleaded with Menenhle. But Menenhle still did the unthinkable. She pointed a stubby finger towards Thandi. And when the Soja took Thandi away, kicking and screaming, Thandi believed she saw a look of satisfaction on Menenhle's face. It was a look that she would never forget nor forgive. The Soja paraded Thandi in front of the whole school, calling her all manner of filth. When he led her to the toilets and they entered one of the pit latrines, Thandi thought for sure that he was going to rape her. She tried to prepare herself for the humiliation and violation, but instead he ordered her to jump into the pit latrine. He left her to drown in its putrid foulness. Now Thandi was sure that she would die, but she did not. Somehow she managed to tread the murky mire and keep her head above it. She desperately wanted to die, but to her dismay and consternation, she kept on surviving until, after what seemed like days but was in reality a little over 2 hours, her father pulled her out. Thandi did not feel like she had been saved. Her mother prepared basin after basin of scalding water and bar after bar of harsh soap for her, but Thandi could not feel clean. From then on, she took to bathing multiple times a day. She became obsessed with dirt. She began to find the omnipresent dust of the compound oppressive. Whenever she was not cleaning herself, she was cleaning her surroundings. But one thing that she could not scrub clean was the air surrounding her, which had been contaminated by the putrescence of the pit latrine. The smell followed her everywhere. Understandably, Thandi became desperate for a fresh start. A fresh start came in the form of Elizabeth Nyoni, who one day descended in a cloud of dust on the Beaufort farm and estate carrying a golden egg. She had travelled to a place she had only heard about, a place in which there was no one to take care of her and her egg, because she was certain that this place was where she was going to do the best living of her life. She was such a foreign concept on the Beaufort farm and estate that Thandi could not help but be drawn to her. Elizabeth was the most singular thing Tandy had ever seen. Her blonde hair, her colourful clothes, her genuine self-confidence and self-esteem, her determination and drive, her believing herself to be a country and western singer, all showed that she marched to the beat of her own drum. In just being herself, Elizabeth presented Tandy with many possibilities. For her part, Elizabeth took to the prettiest Tandy, and one day looked at the girl and simply said, "You are so pretty. Have you ever thought of being a model?" Tandy, who did not know what a model was, could not say that she had. Elizabeth reached for a magazine, flipped through its pages, and pointed at a woman with ruby lips and penciled-in eyebrows who was looking into the distance as though it held a future in which she was not particularly interested. It was the model's nonchalance and detachment that Tandy found attractive, alluring. The model seemed removed from it all, above it, untouchable. If you go to the city, I am sure you could make a living as a model. The city, the place where no one would know or remember what had happened to her. The city, the place where she could start a new, unblemished, unbesmirched chapter of her life. The city, the place where she, with ruby lips and penciled-in eyebrows, could look into the distance as though it held a future in which she was not particularly interested. Tandy boarded the Mackenzie bus the very next day and headed for the city, determined never to look back. It was in the city that, wearing a pink carnation in her hair, she danced in the rain and heard a young man sing, "Don't Let Me Down." Perhaps the knowledge of what had happened to Manentle at the hands of C10 gave Tandy some satisfaction, but this cannot be known with certainty. After Tandy left the Beaufort farm and estate, she returned to it only once, during the war years, to deliver and leave behind a baby boy, Marcus Malcolm Martin. She only offered one word to explain her action: America. Marcus grew up in the care of his strictly Christian grandparents with one spiritual striving, to find something in his young life that would give him a sense of belonging. He found this something, a few days after his 4th birthday, in the form of a colourful woman who carried a baby on her back and sang songs of love. "You treat her like an egg. I don't believe her feet have ever touched the ground. You carry her everywhere." Justina Nxumalo, Ma Nxumalo to Marcus, said this in a neutral tone as she leaned against one of the fence posts, her left arm akimbo and a sliver of elephant grass in her mouth. Her eyes on their target, and the most spectacular thing that young Marcus had ever seen in his entire life, Elizabeth Nyoni. She was hanging her washing on a clothesline and had a baby, well, not really a baby anymore, strapped on her back not too tightly, but very securely, and she was humming a delightful tune. She was dressed in all the colours of the rainbow, the lady's whip, his people called it, as if she had reached into the sky and retrieved each colour with a gentle tug. And she had hair like no one else he had ever seen, long, straight, flowy, and, best of all, golden. Sometimes, Marcus knew, she assembled it all on the top of her head so that it resembled a beehive. Sometimes she let it flow freely and dance gently in the breeze. Marcus had been watching them for a very long time. He did not know how long, because he had not learned how to count or tell time yet. But he knew it was a very long time. He was fascinated by these beautiful creatures. He had come to sit by the fence and watch this colourful woman hum through the day with her not-quite baby on her back, often enough to pique Justina's curiosity. And why shouldn't I treat her like an egg? She was a golden egg for the 5 years I carried her. She was a golden egg until the 3rd of September 1978, when she hatched. Just because you see her like this in the flesh does not mean that she is not still a golden egg, Elizabeth said, and then continued to hum her tune. Justina laughed a loud and long, mirthless laugh. "Elizabeth, the things you say." She brought her laughter to an end. "You are like a peacock, proud." "And why shouldn't I be like a peacock, pride and all, when all that is mine is beauty?" "And vain too," Justina said, clapping her hands together, indicating that she was giving up and was washing her hands of Elizabeth. "Pride and vanity are sins, Elizabeth." "Envy is an ugly thing too, Justina." Justina made a sound of mock disgust deep in the back of her throat. "Anyway, I'm here about the boy." Elizabeth made her way to the fence. The not-quite baby cocked her head to the side and examined him with such scrutiny that Marcus felt self-conscious for the first time in his young life. "Tandy's boy. He is a thing of beauty." "My eyes are not for beauty to see," Justina replied with a shrug. "What's your name?" Elizabeth asked, addressing him directly for the first time. Marcus was too embarrassed to look at her directly, so he mumbled to the yellowish-grey, silty soil and scratch of grass he was sitting on. "Marcus Malcolm Martin Masuku." Elizabeth laughed heartily, a sound that came from deep inside her belly, genuine, free laughter. He had never heard anything like it. He felt his mouth spreading into a smile, ready to laugh. "So you're going to be a revolutionary when you grow up?" He had no idea what she was talking about. His smile became uncertain. "I think he wants to be friends with your precious egg," Justina said, coming to his rescue. "You want to be friends with my Imogen?" "Yes," he nodded, even though the thought had never occurred to him. He would have been happy to just sit by the fence, watch the beautiful creatures, and wish that he belonged to them. "Jeannie, you want to be friends with Marcus Malcolm Martin Masuku?" The little girl on her back neither nodded nor shook her head. She just looked at him. "Well, Marcus Malcolm Martin Masuku, you can be friends with my Jeannie here if you promise me one thing. Can you promise me one thing?" Marcus squinted the sunlight out of his eyes and nodded. "What do you want him to promise? Not to break your egg?" Justina asked. "Promise me that you will not become a politician. Promise me you will become a real revolutionary instead." Since Marcus had no idea what she was talking about, it was very easy for him to nod his head yes. "I need to hear you say the words." "I promise," Marcus said, beginning to feel that this was a very important moment in his life. He stood up. He had seen his grandfather do this, offer his hand to another person. It seemed the occasion called for such a gesture. He stood on his tiptoes and strained to reach his hand over the fence and offer it to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, laughing that belly laugh of hers, shook his hand. She untangled the girl from her back and gently placed her on the ground. Little Imogen, Jeannie, was also embraced by the colours of the lady's whip. Unsteady on her feet, she fluttered and braced herself by placing her hands on the fence. Justina clapped her hands. "Finally her feet touch the ground," she exclaimed before ululating. Elizabeth ignored her. "I am trusting you with my most precious and cherished possession, Marcus Malcolm Martin Masuku. You will take good care of her." This time it was Elizabeth who extended her hand. They shook the promise into existence. Suddenly, a friend. Jeannie pointed at Marcus and made a delighted sound. There was a look of recognition in her eyes. She reached through the fence and grabbed hold of his hand. All she could utter were sounds, twitters really. She was yet to be gifted with language, but he understood her perfectly. A gust of wind, carrying dust and billowing empty plastic bags, came their way. The wind lifted the colors of the rainbow. Jeannie fluttered. Marcus held her hand fast, afraid she would fly away. Unfazed by the wind, Jeannie giggled and continued twittering. She had so much to tell him, and he had all the time to listen. But the wind kept getting stronger and stronger until he had no choice but to let go of her hand. After all the things that the Beaufort farm and estate had witnessed and experienced in its recent history, the friendship that blossomed between Marcus and Jeannie was a much-needed balm. The Theory of Flight. Chapter 3. Marcus and Jeannie. By the time Marcus and Jeannie were old enough to understand the world around them, the recent war seemed but a distant memory, for life on the Beaufort farm and estate had taken great pains to become blissful again. Perhaps it was because their country was newly independent, and a country's independence is infectious and tends to permeate everything. Or perhaps it was because both of them were too young to remember the particular horrors the Civil War had visited upon the compound. Whatever the reason, Marcus and Jeannie both developed a strong sense of adventure and soon grew tired of the monotonous greyish yellow of the compound. They were eager to explore the world outside, and because the farthest thing their eyes could see were the distant hills that looked like a hazy blue something on the horizon, they wanted to personally touch that hazy blue something. If they had been able to tell the passing of time, they would have known that it took close to 6 months to convince Elizabeth, who remembered only too well the horrors of the Civil War, to let them walk out of the compound and down the long dusty road that seemed to stretch on forever, only to lose itself in the distant hills. They never realized that she let them go only because she knew they could not go far. And so it came to pass that on a clear day in December, Marcus and Jeanie left the compound for the first time in their lives. It never occurred to either Marcus or Jeanie, as they set off down the dusty road armed only with a broken umbrella, a half-eaten packet of lemon creams, and a bottle of water, that they could actually climb the hills. From the stories they heard at night around the compound fire, they knew that what lived on the other side of the hills was terrifyingly wicked and relentlessly evil. They also knew, from the around the fire stories, that the hills themselves were innocent, and that therefore there was absolutely nothing wrong with touching them and feeling their reassuring permanence. Since they could see the hills, they thought it would not take long to reach them. They probably had not walked as far as they thought. Jeanie with Penelope, her handmade rag doll, whose dark brown skin and colourful dress her mother had made from scraps left over from material she used to make dresses for herself and Jeanie, tied on her back and secured there by a towel that was knotted around her waist, carrying a broken umbrella above their heads as Marcus drove his wire car along the dusty road, one trouser pocket stuffed with the lemon creams and the other containing the water bottle, when their dusty legs grew tired. As their determination to reach the distant hills rapidly waned, they were more than happy to discover to the left of them a field of yellow that stretched as far as the eye could see. Sunflowers. They had never been told that such a thing of beauty existed. Without hesitation, Jeanie ran giggling into the field, never stopping to think that it could contain anything harmful or dangerous. Marcus hesitated. He left his wire car on the side of the road, in full view of any passers-by, just in case he and Jeanie got lost in there. Disappeared in a sea of yellow, never to be found again. If anyone came to find them, they would know exactly where to look, and, if the two of them were never found again, at least people would know exactly what had happened. Marcus was a cautious, but not particularly morbid child. He just knew from all the stories told around the compound fire that not all stories had a happy ending, and that horrible things sometimes happened to people, especially curious children who ventured too far away from home. Playing among the sunflowers proved to be a happy distraction from the quest to reach the hazy blue something. Marcus and Jeanie ran laughing and zigzagging through the stalks, not really sure who was trying to catch whom. And so it was that, day after day, they left the compound intent on reaching the distant hills, but, day after day, found themselves playing among the sunflowers. Then one day they gave up the quest altogether and simply made their way straight to the sunflowers. After that, it did not take long for the hazy blue hills in the distance to become a distant memory. When they were not playing Catch Me If You Can, Jeanie sang songs she had learned from her mother and told stories she had heard around the compound fires to a very appreciative audience of sunflowers. They continued to find pleasure in the sunflowers, even as the petals began to shrivel, the stalks hardened, and the brown faces of the sunflowers became darker and downcast. Then one day all laughter died, just like that. Unable to comprehend, Marcus and Jeanie stared at all the sunflowers lying on the reddish-brown soil, no longer reaching for the sky. They had all been felled to the ground, every single one. Jeanie desperately tried to get them standing again, and Marcus had no choice but to help her. With their hands they dug the reddish-brown soil and reinstated the stalks to their rightful places. Some stood, but most fell down again. Jeanie was determined. She did not care how long it would take. All she told herself was that one day all the sunflowers would be replanted. But when they arrived the next morning, the scene was worse than any they could have imagined. The sunflowers were gone, all of them, even the ones they had put upright again. There was not a trace, not a forlorn green stalk, not a withered yellow petal, not an abandoned brownish black seed. No evidence at all that this had recently been a populated sunflower field. The barren scene truly broke Jeanie's heart, and for the first time in her life she turned her face away from the sun. Wordlessly, Jeanie sank to the reddish-brown soil and cried silent tears, another first in her short life. Marcus put his arm around her, but at that moment became old enough to know that Jeanie's grief was something he could not console away. He was sad, not for himself, but for Jeanie, because, although he understood that this was a loss, he knew that the loss was mostly hers. She had loved the sunflowers in a way that he had not. She had loved them deeply. He had not. She had loved them with every fibre of her being. He had not. In truth, he had loved the sunflowers only because Jeanie loved them. He saw that they were beautiful, but were it not for Jeanie, he would not have seen that theirs was a beauty worth cherishing. On that day, Marcus made another discovery. It was a discovery he could only have made because of the sunflower's disappearance. As Jeanie planted her feet in the reddish-brown soil and sifted it through her fingers in a vain effort to find something that remained, a glint on the horizon caught Marcus's eye. In the early morning sunlight, he made out the carcass of a car. The abandoned car had been there all along, lonely as it listened to them play and laugh in the field, lonely as it listened to Jeanie sing and tell stories to the sunflowers, lonely as it watched them walk away without being discovered. The loneliness of the abandoned car filled Marcus with a sadness that made him want to run towards it without hesitation and touch it. It was only Jeanie's grief that stopped him from doing so. In a show of solidarity, he too sifted the soil through his fingers. But he could not bring himself to bury his feet in the reddish-brown soil. Every now and then, his eyes stole looks at the abandoned car. Perhaps the biggest challenge that now presented itself in young Marcus's life was how to tell Jeanie about the abandoned car. Every day, secretly, he visited the car, a Morris Mini Minor that he christened Brown Car, more for its rusty patches than for its original beige color. He found time for these secret visits in those moments when Elizabeth found it necessary to have her daughter close to her, when she washed their clothes and hung them to dry, when she cooked their meals, when she combed and plaited their hair, when she dressed them both in bright, colorful clothes, when she wanted someone to sing to or sing with, or when she simply wanted to have her daughter close so that she could pick her up whenever she felt like it and twirl her in the air and hug her fiercely and pepper her skin with kisses and listen to Jeanie giggle and giggle as though she knew no end to laughter and happiness. Before they discovered the sunflower field, and before he discovered Brown Car, Marcus's favorite time of the day had been bath time. Not his bath time, which consisted of his grandmother religiously scrubbing his body with a coarse face cloth and harsh soap that was sudsy enough but stung his eyes and prickled his nose and made him sneeze repeatedly as his grandmother told him about the dangers of dirt and vanity while he stood in a sink galvanized steel bucket which was filled with just enough cold water to make him clean. No, not that bath time, but Jeanie's and Elizabeth's. They bathed together, and their bath time was filled with laughter and giggles and songs and warm water splishing and splashing in their enamel cast iron tub, the warm and comforting scent of vanilla wafting out of the high window of their bathroom, under which Marcus stoically sat, even though the other boys in the compound teased him mercilessly for doing so. From under the window, Marcus could hear the conversations they had. "Ma, when I grow up, will I have breasts as big as yours?" "Would you like to have breasts as big as mine?" "Yes, most definitely." "Then you shall." "Ma, when I grow up, will I have a bottom as round as yours?" "Would you like to have a bottom as round as mine?" "Yes, maybe even rounder." "Then you shall," replied a laughing voice. "Ma, when I grow up, will I be as beautiful as you?" "No, you'll be much more beautiful than me. You'll be a true sight to behold." "But I don't want to be more beautiful than you." "Then you'll have to try very hard not to be." "Ma, I know that I came from somewhere in your heart." "Yes, you did. And that I was an egg." "A golden egg." "Does that mean—" "Marcus says that means I don't have a father." Marcus knows as much as Marcus can know. "Do I have a father?" "It depends." "On what?" "On the future." Marcus had fallen asleep many a time under that open window, lulled by the warm vanilla scent, their soothing voices, generous laughter, and genuine happiness. But after he discovered Brown Car, he no longer spent time under the high window. He spent his time breathing in the surprisingly comforting smell of rusting metal and rotting seat cushioning. It was an old and somewhat familiar smell. His fingers reveling in the curve of the steering wheel, Marcus imagined himself driving down the long, dusty road away from the compound and towards the hazy blue hills, always with Jeanie by his side in the passenger seat and her beloved Penelope in the back. Marcus did all the driving because, from what he had seen on the compound, only men drove vehicles. It had never occurred to him that his imagination did not have to be bound by the reality of the compound. And as he fantasized about these journeys to and from the compound, he tried to devise a plan to tell Jeanie about his new love, Brown Car. As it turned out, he did not have to. One day, as he imagined himself driving down the dirt road with Jeanie by his side, he smelled the warm scent of vanilla and wood smoke, and turned to see Jeanie looking at him from the passenger seat, a rare frown creasing her brow, her arms crossed and resting on her slightly distended belly. "So this is it?" she said, looking over the interior of Brown Car with no hint of the admiration he felt when he looked at the car. "This is what made you steal away from me?" What was he supposed to say to that? The ever-present Penelope also seemed to give him a disapproving look from her secure position on Jeanie's back. He felt his heart sink. And then Jeanie's face broke into a smile, the gap between her two front teeth making him smile too, as it always did. And from then on, that was how they spent most of their mornings and afternoons, slowly baking in Brown Car's carcass, together travelling to the places contained within their imaginations, places they had heard of, China, Egypt, England, the Soviet Union, and America. In their imaginations, the places all looked exactly like the compound, except China had a great wall running around it. Egypt had pyramids and sphinxes where the schoolrooms were. England had a stuffy and stiff queen looking very out of place in the greyish-yellow dust of the compound as she walked around in her bejewelled crown and heavy red cloak, looking for someone called Margaret Thatcher, but never finding her. The Soviet Union had the word communism, or rather, as Marcus and Jeanie spelled it, communism, planted on every building in the compound in big red letters. America contained Marcus's parents, who manifested themselves as younger versions of Marcus's grandmother and grandfather, the way they looked in their wedding photo, Christian, proper, and unsmiling. The America that Marcus's parents lived in was filled with men riding horses and wearing Stetsons, and men driving fast cars and wearing fedoras. In other words, they lived in the America seen in the bioscope. During their many travels, Marcus and Jeanie even visited Jeanie's father, Golidi Gomere, in the future. It was Jeanie's idea to borrow the World Atlas from Marcus's grandfather's scant library so that they would have more places to visit. Unfortunately, it had been printed in 1965 and did not contain the name of their newly independent country. The World Atlas therefore presented them with more possibilities as well as more challenges. Their newly independent country could have been any of those land masses, surrounded by even larger masses of water. It could have been one of those teeny tiny shapes that seemed to be in grave danger of being swallowed whole by the masses of water. As a result, their newly independent country sometimes found itself in the center of the world map, sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south, sometimes in the east, and sometimes in the west. Marcus and Jeanie already understood that the world had a fluidity to it, even if they did not as yet understand their place in it. Worlds and possibilities unfurled before them, creating dizzying delights. So engrossed were they in their travels that it took them a while to realize that shoots were beginning to rise out of the reddish-brown earth. The sunflowers were being reborn. This was how they learned their most valuable lesson about death, that after it there is life again, that things that perish will rise again, that after every ending there is another beginning. And so, although they spent the days and afternoons traveling the globe, their eyes also patiently watched the sunflowers grow stronger as they reached towards the sun. They watched as the leaves appeared. They watched as 1,000,000 blooms burst in unison. They watched as 1,000,000 brown faces turned towards the sun. And Jeanie chose that exact moment to take her rightful place among them, welcoming the familiar itch of her skin as her arms came into contact with the stalks, and enjoying the cool dampness of the reddish-brown soil as her toes burrowed in, rooting her in her place. It was one day, while they were in the sunflower field, that the first truly strange thing happened. Through the stalks, they saw a car sputter to a stop. 2 men were inside. Neither of them got out. The driver simply rolled down his window and proceeded to smoke a cigarette, blowing smoke rings out of the open window as though he had all the time in the world. From their vantage point within the sunflowers, Marcus and Jeanie could see enough of the men to know that they did not know them. They did not belong to the Beaufort Farm End estate. After the war, strangers had been very rare on the Beaufort Farm End estate. Even so, Marcus knew enough about strangers to hold on fast to Jeanie's hand. Jeanie, who had a tendency to run towards everything without hesitation. They stood among the stalks for a long time holding hands, not moving, afraid to breathe. Then the man in the passenger seat got out and walked towards them. Marcus and Jeanie held a collective breath, fearing something, though not really sure what. The man stood right at the edge of the sunflower field and started unzipping his trousers. It was then that Marcus risked everything and moved. He lifted the hand that was not clutching Jeanie's hand and used it to cover her eyes. He shut his own. They heard the man's urine splash onto the reddish-brown soil. It was only when they heard the car door slam shut that Marcus removed his hand from Jeanie's eyes and opened his own. They felt too embarrassed to look at each other. Not looking at each other is what allowed them to witness the astonishing things that happened next. Just as the coolness in the air and the changing color of light through the sunflower petals was letting them know that the sun was beginning to set, the boot of the car popped open, and out of it slowly unfolded an impossibly tall man, like a jack-in-the-box that was taking its time to surprise them. This time, Marcus and Jeanie held their collective breath in sheer awe. The driver and the passenger got out of the car and joined the third man. They had a long whispered conversation before they shook hands, grasping each other's upper arms with their free hands, a sure sign of something deeply felt. Without even having to say anything to each other, Marcus and Jeanie knew that they would be greeting each other like that from then on. The driver and the passenger got back in the car, which came alive without a sputter. It made a quick U-turn and raised a lot of dust in the air, so much that Marcus and Jeanie had to strain to see what was happening. The driver said something to the third man that he responded to with a smile. Then all 3 men brought their right hands towards their foreheads at a very sharp angle. Then just as suddenly and just as simultaneously, they brought their hands down in a sharp motion. Goodbye. Without even having to say anything to each other, Marcus and Jeanie knew that they would be saying goodbye to each other like that from then on too. The car slowly drove away. The third man remained in the cloud of dust, but started to turn towards the compound. His eyes quickly swept over the sunflowers. Then he stopped. Jeanie immediately let go of Marcus's hand and ran towards the man. They seemed to share a mutual elation at having discovered one another. The man threw Jeanie into the air. Marcus was terrified. The man caught Jeanie with a smile. It was only when he saw the gap between the man's 2 front teeth that Marcus felt safe enough to leave the sunflower field. When the man shifted his smiling eyes from Jeanie to Marcus, Marcus was grateful to see that they did not lose any of their warmth. He basked in the warm glow of their welcome as he shyly, and in a manly way, or so he hoped, shook the man's hand. All 3 of them were so wrapped up in getting acquainted that they did not notice Elizabeth hurtling towards them with the speed and ferocity of a mother elephant that knows its calf is in danger. Dust rose in her wake as the many colors of her dress seemed determined to fly off her body. The blonde hair that often sat on top of her head had long flown off and been trampled by some of the other residents of the compound who were following her, sensing instinctively that something either spectacular or tragic was happening and that they would need to bear witness. "Golide!" Elizabeth bellowed before coming to an abrupt stop. Her eyes were wide with wonder, confusion, relief, joy, and pain. Her body trembled with the force of feeling all these emotions at once. Justina strategically started ululating. Relieved to finally have something to do, the compound residents celebrated. The women ululated and danced a jig. Then the men did a very elaborate warrior dance, kicking their legs high into the air, humming and chanting a warrior song deep in their throats. The younger members of the compound did not do the jig or the warrior dance. They were too modern for that. They chose instead to do the twist, and the really gifted among them even braved the mapansula. No one, not a single person, minded all the dust that the joy of the occasion raised as they made their way back towards the compound. Golide seemed at once both touched and embarrassed by the attention. However, this spontaneous excess of sheer joy was not unwarranted, for Golide Gomede, Liberation War hero, had returned home alive and well, unlike so many others who had returned broken or had not returned at all. The presence of life after the death and devastation of war was definitely something worth celebrating. Marcus had never before felt such a deep sense of belonging as when he walked nestled between Elizabeth and Golide, each of his hands in one of theirs. He smiled up at Jeanie, and she smiled down at him from where she sat, perched resplendently on her father's shoulders. This was to be the happiest day of their young lives. It was while they were in Brown Car that the second truly strange thing happened. A few years had passed since Jeanie's father's return. Things all around had changed. There was more traffic along the dirt road. A mobile library came once a month, allowing residents of the compound to borrow one book each. Marcus borrowed a different volume of The Adventures of Tintin every month. Jeanie borrowed The Firebird and renewed it every month. Marcus enjoyed challenging his lips and tongue with Captain Haddock's alliteration-obsessed diatribes, and Jeanie was enamored of the pretty pictures of the beautifully colourful birds, as well as the story of how it remained elusive for Prince Ivan and sent him on a tremendous quest. In addition to the mobile library, a mobile clinic came once a week. A Mackenzie bus came twice a week from the city, resuming the schedule that had been suspended during the Liberation War. Within Brown Car, things had also changed. Penelope had been joined by Specs, a teddy bear who wore glasses that had been a Christmas present to Jeanie from her father. Penelope left the permanent security of Jeanie's back to be with Specs on the back seat. The death and resurrection of the sunflowers were now things Marcus and Jeanie were accustomed to, so they were content to look on miles and miles of barren reddish-brown soil. They felt so secure in their happiness that when the second strange thing happened, it took them a while to realize that it was actually a threat to their happiness. A flashy car drove up the dirt road at a very high speed, which was strange enough in and of itself, because most vehicles had the good sense to travel slowly and carefully on the dirt road, knowing it was highly unpredictable and never to be trusted. The car whizzed by so fast that there was no way Marcus and Jeanie could tell who or what was in it. Truth be told, they did not particularly care to know. A few minutes after it had disappeared, they ceased to think about it altogether. Some time later, the imprudently fast car made its way back down the dirt road. This time, though, it seemed to have learnt its lesson and proceeded slowly and with caution. Marcus and Jeanie were surprised when everyone they loved, Jeanie's parents and Marcus's grandparents, alighted from the back of the car. From the front, two people alighted, a man and a woman who looked too shiny. Their clothes were shimmery, their skin, unburnt by the sun, looked burnished. Their too long hair, both his and hers, was glossy and incongruously curly as it glinted in the sun. Marcus was at first embarrassed for them. Then he immediately felt guilty for being embarrassed, because he knew without being told that these were his parents, fresh from America. The woman, he supposed he had to think of her as his mother now, came rushing towards him, arms outstretched, yelling, "Honey!" Marcus got out of Brown Car, hesitantly, cautiously, reluctantly. Jeanie understood his apprehension, so she got out of Brown Car with him and held his hand. The woman, his mother, frowned at Jeanie before hugging Marcus. "You're just as beautiful as I knew you would be," she said, covering his face with kisses. She smelled of something so sweet that it made Marcus and Jeanie sneeze at the same time. "Aren't you precious?" the woman said, looking at Jeanie and smiling a smile that did not reach her eyes or remove the frown from her forehead. "Yes, I am precious," Jeanie replied matter-of-factly, which only deepened the woman's frown. "Is her name Precious?" The The woman asked no one in particular as she finally stood up and smoothed her shiny appearance. "My name is Jeanie." "Oh, how precious." The man, Marcus supposed he had to think of him as his father now, came forward, but seemed not to know what to do next. Marcus strongly suspected that the man, his father, felt foolish, looking so shiny next to his grandfather and Jeanie's father, who looked like real men. "Oh, Dee, you are hopeless. You both are," the woman said, laughing and pushing the man towards Marcus. Finally the man, his father, Dee, offered Marcus his hand, and Marcus and he shook hands. "Oh," the woman squealed, "I wish we had brought a camera. We should have thought of it." She squealed some more. "Oh, this is just too precious," she said, clasping her hands together in sheer delight. "We have a surprise for you in the car," she announced, reaching out her hand to Marcus. When he shook her hand hesitantly, she lifted him up with such surprising force that he had to let go of Jeanie. Without warning, his mother started walking rather quickly towards the flashy car and away from Jeanie. Marcus looked at Jeanie over his mother's shoulder as the distance between them grew at an alarming rate. Even though his grandparents and Jeanie's parents were there, he felt that he was in danger and that something horrible was happening. "Jeanie!" he all but screamed. She ran after him shouting, "Marcus!" The worry in her voice matched the fear in his. "Perhaps there is another way to do this," Golide was saying. "Surely you see how very attached they are to each other," Elizabeth added. "I'm sorry," the woman, his mother, said, holding him tighter. "It is not our intention to be cruel, but you all know what's going on. It's no longer safe here." "It never was safe, but we survived. We've always survived," his grandmother said. Marcus turned to look at her. Her voice had sounded hard, but there was a tenderness in her moist eyes which were fixed on Marcus. His grandmother had never looked at him like that before. His grandmother had never cried in his presence before. It was when he looked at his grandmother that the reality of what was happening to him became clear. The surprise in the car was simply a ruse. This woman and this man, his mother and his father, his parents, were here to take him away. Suddenly feeling trapped by his mother's arms, Marcus struggled to release himself, kicking his feet and flailing his arms. He knew he was hurting her. Perhaps he even meant to hurt her. But his mother's hold on him only got stronger. He dug his fingernails as deep as they could into her neck and then dragged them. She let out a startled, sharp cry of pain, but still did not let him go. "You'll thank us for this one day," she said. Marcus seriously doubted it. Since he had no intention of leaving the Beaufort farm and estate, he grabbed hold of one of her loop earrings and pulled as hard as he could. As the earring ripped through her earlobe and Marcus felt her warm blood ooze into his hand, his father opened the passenger door to the imprudent car. It was then that Marcus sank his teeth into his mother's cheek. But it was already too late. She was already sitting in the car and hugging him to her body. He heard the door lock after his father banged it shut. He saw Jeanie reach the door and try its handle before her own mother swept her up, saying, "Let him go. You have to let him go." It was then that he saw something enter Jeanie's eyes as she looked at him. It made him give up the fight entirely. Everything became a blur. "I'm sure in time we'll be able to put all of this behind us," his father said, getting into the car. Marcus could not tell whether he was saying this to the people in the car or to the people outside. Marcus blinked away the tears in time to see Jeanie give him a smile. He knew it was not a genuine smile. It was a smile meant to give him courage. He did not want someone to give him courage. He wanted someone to save him. And then Jeanie did the unthinkable. She raised her hand in a sharp angle and brought it to her forehead. Goodbye. She waited for him to do the same, but he absolutely refused to say goodbye. Suddenly there was dust all over as the car sped away, and then Marcus could no longer see the sunflower field. He wondered for a long time afterwards if Jeanie, believing he had returned her salute, had completed the gesture by bringing her hand sharply down. Had she really said goodbye to him and let him go forever, just like that? Or was she still waiting, her right hand at a sharp angle to her forehead? In the car, his mother pressed her cheek to the top of his head and rocked him gently. "You'll see. You'll thank us for saving you. You'll thank us someday." She repeated the words over and over again as though she were reciting a lullaby. His eyes grew heavy. His body was tired from the fight. It was only as his eyes struggled to stay open that he noticed the other woman in the car, an older woman, and in her arms she held a sleeping child, a girl who seemed encased in frilly pink. "That's our surprise," his father's voice said. "She's your little sister, and her name is Crystal." Marcus looked at his father, who smiled at him, obviously happy about something. He looked back at the unsmiling older woman holding the girl. "That is your grandmother, my mother." "We are your family now," his new grandmother said, still not smiling. They all looked beautiful, the members of his family, but Marcus felt that their beauty was not to be trusted. It was a dangerous beauty. He was suddenly more terrified than he had ever been before. He let go of his bladder then, well aware that his urine would soil both his shorts and his mother's shiny dress. The Theory of Flight, Chapter 4. BeGiThemba. In 1988, a couple of years after the Masukus took Marcus away from the Beaufort Farm mid-estate, BeGiThemba Nyati drove stealthily, under the cover of darkness, up that same road. He had first driven up the road in the light of day a few months earlier, and it was because of that first trip that he was making this second trip. He parked his car some distance from the compound, walked through the barren sunflower fields, and was astounded by the eerie silence of the place, where even the dogs refrained from howling at the full moon or barking at him. The life that was once here had disappeared. BeGiThemba shone a torch into a disused well when something glimmered at the bottom, shocking him with its sudden unexpectedness. As he stole away from the compound, feeling both relieved and wary that he had found nothing, no one in the well, he tried to reconcile the man he now was with the man he had thought that he would be. The year was 1980, and BeGiThemba, perhaps for the first time in his life, felt rooted, connected to everything and everyone around him, a son of the soil in a real, literal sense. He was something that had germinated and sprouted, broken through the earth, from this very spot. His eyes stung, his throat choked, his lungs filled with something heavy and bitter. People ran helter-skelter, seeking safe spaces. Chaos, confusion, panic, uncertainty, fear, all around him, and yet here he stood unmoved, rooted, connected, certain. The tear gas would clear, and when it did, he would still be in this moment in history. He had come all this way to see Prince Charles, and hopefully shake his hand. His own grandfather had shaken the hands of various members of the British royal family, King George VI, the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and Princess Margaret. By the time his grandfather passed away, he had lost most of his memory. He had forgotten his own name, which was Cosmos Nyati. He had forgotten the name of his Christian wife and those of his 2 common-law wives. He had forgotten the names of his 13 children and those of his 28 grandchildren. He had even forgotten that he was a successful businessman whose enterprising spirit had seen him leave his life in the family village at the age of 16 to work as a stock boy for a Mr. Mackenzie at the Mackenzie General Goods Store. By the time he died, Cosmos Nyati had forgotten that at the age of 17 he had suggested to Mr. Mackenzie that he open a bottle store. Although Mr. Mackenzie's General Goods Store was the only store for kilometers, his business was failing because people seemed to prefer the traveling goodsmen who always gave you a little extra something, a bonsela, as an added bonus for patronizing their business. Since the Mackenzie General Goods Store was located just outside a mission station, Mr. Mackenzie doubted that a bottle store would have enough customers, considering it would be within the ever-watchful purview of the missionaries. But because Mr. Mackenzie was at his wit's end, a favorite phrase of his whenever he spoke of his relationship with the colony, he agreed to open a bottle store on condition that Cosmos would manage it himself. The Mackenzie bottle store proved so successful that Mr. Mackenzie soon decided to open another one in another village, and once again sent Cosmos to manage it. Because of the popularity of the 2 bottle stores, Mackenzie became a household name, and the general goods store became successful by association. By the time he died, Cosmos-Nyati had also forgotten that when Mr. Mackenzie had come to another wit's end, this time not with the colony, but with the situation brewing in Europe, he suddenly returned to Scotland in 1938 and had been generous enough to bequeath the Mackenzie General Goods Store and the 2 Mackenzie bottle stores to the very man who had made them a success. In 1938, most African men would have been very happy to own 3 successful stores, but Cosmos-Nyati was not. He grew his business to include the Mackenzie line of buses and the Mackenzie Bioscope. He was what was known in the colonies as a good African, primarily Christian, mostly hard-working, generally clean and sober. And because of this, whenever there was a royal tour, he was brought forward as an example of the progress the colony had made with its African population, which was how he came to shake the hands of King George VI, the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and Princess Margaret. Of all the things that he had done in his 72 years, he was proudest of the moments when he had shaken the hands of royalty, and so, as he entered the twilight of his years, he forgot all but these moments. When he passed away, he left his family with 2 inheritances, the Mackenzie businesses and his pride in the family's connection to the British royal family. This was why, when Bheki Themba made his way to the stadium to see Prince Charles receive the Union Jack and witness the flag of the newly independent country being raised in its place, he was filled with the family pride and a great deal of sadness over the sun finally setting on the empire. At the age of 18, he had enough hubris to believe that he would have a private moment with Prince Charles to say, "My grandfather, Cosmos-Nyati, owner of the Mackenzie businesses, knew your grandfather and your mother. He was a good African." He shook their hands. And Prince Charles would say in turn, "Cosmos-Nyati, of course. My grandfather and mother talked of him often. He was indeed a good African, very enterprising for one of his kind." Then Bheki Themba would tell Prince Charles that he was strongly opposed to his country ceasing to be a British colony, that he had deliberately not joined the armed struggle led by the terrorists, and that he, at age 18, was very much saddened by the fact that he and all his future children would not be British subjects. Of course, that is not how things had turned out. The Union Jack had indeed come down, been folded, and handed over to the future King of England, and Bheki Themba had surprised himself by feeling absolutely nothing. He was confused by this, his lack of feeling. Prince Charles had seemed ill at ease, anemic, and far removed from everything that was happening around him. Whether he was just above it all, or whether he was simply uninterested, Bheki Themba could not tell. Instead of being a prince, he seemed to be playing at future king in his bright white military regalia. Bheki Themba suspected that the shoes the prince was wearing were slightly too big for him. In all honesty, the prince had proved to be something of a disappointment. Just as Bheki Themba was reconciling himself to an anticlimactic evening, a man in dreadlocks got on the stage, raised up a fisted hand, and called out, "Viva!" The crowd went wild, and Bheki Themba felt something stir within him, something nascent, a beautiful beginning. For the first time, he became fully aware of the throng around him and of its elation and euphoria at finally being independent and free. He was jostled this way and that, but he did not mind. This closeness, this tight togetherness was actually comforting. The dreadlocked man, eyes closed, strummed his guitar. 3 women, sirens really, made melodious sounds. The crowd moved as one and carried Bheki Themba along. For the first time, Bheki Themba felt part of something larger than himself. The man opened his eyes and looked directly at Bheki Themba. "Viva!" the man called out again. The crowd went wild, shouting "Viva!" in reply, and Bheki Themba felt himself joining them with his own "Viva!" even though he did not know what the word meant. Then he felt something travel through his body, a jolt of electricity that traveled from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, grounding him, connecting him to the soil. The crowd, with Bheki Themba in it, became one moving, breathing, almost menacing force. Bheki Themba could do nothing but look at the dreadlocked man, mesmerized. It was the dreadlocked man who was doing this to the people. He seemed to possess a certain power, a power that Prince Charles did not possess, the power to move, unite, and inspire people. Later, Bheki Temba would know that this power was called charisma. This dreadlocked man, Bheki Temba was certain, was going to lead him to something great. The dreadlocked man closed his eyes again. There was a flash of light. The air grew thick with smoke that stung the eyes and filled the lungs with something bitter. The crowd panicked, helter-skelter. Bheki Temba would not move. He felt too connected, too rooted. He waited patiently for the dreadlocked man to open his eyes again. If it so happened that he was destined to die here, on this spot, in his 18th year, so be it. He would gladly die, but only after the dreadlocked man had opened his eyes. The smoke cleared. The sting left his eyes. He took a deep breath. Clean, clear air filled his lungs. The man on the stage opened his eyes, looked straight at Bheki Temba again. Something like a smile, a lazy smile, played on his lips. A look of respect entered his eyes. The dreadlocked man's band and his melodious backing singers returned to the stage. It was only then that Bheki Temba realized that everyone else had run away as soon as the smoke had filled the air. "Now I know who is the real revolutionary," the dreadlocked man said, still looking directly at him. Bheki Temba felt as though he had been anointed. For the rest of his life, he would feel a strong connection to that man. He would speak of his encounter with the dreadlocked man with just as much pride as his grandfather had had in speaking of shaking the hands of British royalty. Bheki Temba was known to find the perfect moment, whatever the occasion, to stand up in a gathering and regale them with the story of how Bob Marley had looked at him through the smoke of a tear-gas-filled stadium and told him that he was a real revolutionary. That encounter changed him. It had filled him with a pride in his country and in his blackness that he had never had before. He wrote of this life-changing encounter as a letter to the editor for the local state-run newspaper. The letter was printed, and a few days later he received a call from the man himself, praising his writing and offering him a scholarship to study journalism at the local state-run university. Bheki Temba, the anointed one, happily took up the offer. Soon after graduating, he went to work for one of the local state-run newspapers, his pride in his country making him a great mouthpiece for the state. He was a nationalist. He was a patriot. He was a revolutionary. He firmly believed that he lived in the country that Bob Marley had sung so proudly and so passionately about, and now he wrote about his country with equal pride and passion. Truth be told, Bheki Temba felt the privilege of being so singled out by the man himself. It was not lost on him that his connection to the man himself accorded him respect among his peers and helped him garner a reputation. If he had felt any guilt over being so cherry-picked, he was able to do away with it by convincing himself that he was the man that his country needed at this particular moment. As a young man, it embarrassed him to admit that he had been so colonized, that he had not once considered joining the liberation struggle because, like his grandfather and father before him, he had so loved being a British subject. But he was sober enough now to reflect on that period of his life objectively. His country had not needed him then. Perhaps he would have been killed, and what good would that have been for the country? His country needed him now. He could write the kind of stories that would help him build the new nation. He would be the one to change his country from a racist, divided country into a multiracial, unified country. The man himself told Bheki Temba that because the country was still young and working out its differences, and because civil wars often had repercussions, conflict was inevitable. However, the country had an image to portray and protect, and Western countries were waiting for it to fail. It was Bheki Temba's job to ensure that the West did not receive any ammunition with which to destroy the country's image. Bheki Temba understood why the West should not be given reason to discredit or malign the country, but he also believed that the country should be given a chance to examine itself, because that was the only way it could understand itself fully, make necessary changes, and create an equal society. That was the real revolution, as far as Bheki Temba was concerned, the creation of an equal, discrimination-free, all-inclusive society. To this end, he wrote award-winning articles on women's right to wear trousers, on the dignity of the disabled, on the plight of farm workers, on the history of the colored people, on the rich cultural heritage of the Khoisan, on why women deserved equal pay, on the importance of commercial farming to the national economy. Often, the man himself would call Bheki Temba and praise him on an article he had written, always making sure to quote a particular paragraph, turn of phrase, or scintillating sentence. Bheki Temba always felt honored and humbled by such attention and strove to write and do even better. As a reporter, he prided himself on his objectivity, his ability to present all sides of the story, and his providing his fellow citizens with information that helped them to better understand their country and each other. His articles often led to very engaged exchanges of ideas and opinions in the letter to the editor section. The man himself informed Bheki Temba that he was thinking of shaking things up at one of the local state-run newspapers, which still had too many white journalists and therefore did not reflect the independence of the majority. Would Bheki Temba Nyati like to be the new head of investigative reporting? Bheki Temba had just turned 25 and felt old enough for such a responsibility. He took the promotion. When someone from a car assembly plant called him to tell him that state ministers were illegally reselling cars that they had received for free as part of their payment packages, one had resold as many as 11 cars, Bheki Temba thought it a good story to highlight corruption and make people think about why they elected officials and what kind of character an elected official should have. He could already see the conversation that would play out in the letter to the editor section. He wrote the piece, but it was not printed. He spoke to the editor-in-chief, who told him that from now on he could only report on things that the man himself told him to. The editor-in-chief laughed at the confusion on Bheki Temba's face. "Aye, you're green," he said. "The man himself also has illegally resold several cars, and you actually thought we would be able to run the story. The time will come for such a story, trust me, but for now this is our free press." Bheki Temba called the man himself and was told he was out of the office. He did so 5 times before he realized that the man himself was deliberately avoiding him. He went to work the following day, awaiting the call from the man himself that would let him know what he could write on. The call never came. He reported to work for almost 3 months, receiving a paycheck every fortnight, but the man himself did not call. Bheki Temba sat at his desk with nothing to do and watched as his colleagues bustled about. He noticed things, the wear and tear of the furniture, the cobwebs in the corners, the grey grime creeping up the windows, the smell of boiled cabbage that wafted up from the company cafeteria and remained trapped in the building for the first time. He knew every chip and chink in the furniture, how many cobwebs there were, what progress the grey grime had made, and where the boiled cabbage smelled strongest and where it was overcome by the smell of sun-baked urine that rose up from the alley behind the building. He realized how much he had compromised himself through his association with the man himself. His colleagues would not talk to him, would not look him in the eye. He felt certain that they laughed at him behind his back for thinking that he had curried the favor of the man himself. He thought of seeking employment at another newspaper, but all newspapers were state-run, and he was now wise enough to know that it would be a futile exercise. Perhaps if he had not received a paycheck every 2 weeks, he would have felt better. But he did, and he knew that the paycheck for the services not rendered was the man himself's way of communicating something. Power. That was when he heard the rumor. People in a particular region of the country were systematically being disappeared by the state. Bheki Temba refused to believe it, even when the rumors became more specific. It was a particular ethnic group in this particular region of the country which was systematically being disappeared by the state. Bheki Temba was steadfast in his refusal to believe the rumors. And then news arrived that his cousin, someone he remembered playing with as a boy, someone who, unlike Bheki Temba, had decided to cross the Zambezi River to become a freedom fighter, had been disappeared. He knew that the story of his cousin's disappearance would be forever uninvestigated, unwritten, and unsolved. Something stung his eyes and filled his lungs with bitterness. He blinked his eyes, swallowed hard, and decided to ignore it. By the time the man himself called Bheki Temba and gave him a direct assignment. He had learned his lesson well. The man himself told him that there was a crazy man on the Beaufort farm and estate who believed he was capable of flight and was cultivating a race of angels, followers who believed that they too were capable of flight. The man was building a giant pair of silver wings so that he could fly the woman he loved to Nashville, Tennessee. The man's followers touched the wings, prayed to the wings, kept watch over the wings, made offerings to the wings, all in hopes of one day having wings of their own. The man himself said that this would be the perfect story with which to amuse the masses during a difficult time. For Beggy Temba, the story of the crazy man and his cult was obviously one worth telling, not because it was amusing, but because it was about the audacity to believe. He could already see the letter to the editor's section abuzz with excitement. This was how he was going to redeem his fall from grace. There was only one problem. Beggy Temba did not believe in love, at least not in romantic love. He understood the love one had for one's parents and for one's country, but that sort of love was born of respect and gratitude. It was a sort of giving back. There was a reason for that kind of love. It was only natural to love the things that had given you life, a sense of place, a feeling of belonging, a connection to things beyond yourself. You could not exist without these things, and so of course you loved them. It was a selfish love, a love of self-preservation. Selfish love was understandable, reasonable. But romantic love had no reason. Beggy Temba had read somewhere that it was merely an invention, something that could preoccupy people, a yearning that could never be fulfilled, something that would make one's life a quest rather than a series of unrelated, mostly boring events. And so Beggy Temba did not quite believe that this man building a giant pair of silver wings was doing it for love, love of a woman. Beggy Temba suspected that there was another reason, more interesting, more real, more reasonable, and that in itself was a story enough for him. Intrigued, Beggy Temba made his way to the Beaufort farm and estate. He drove up a dusty road surrounded by a sea of sunflowers. Out of the sunflowers came a flash of colourful light that made Beggy Temba bring his car to an abrupt stop. In the middle of nowhere, anything was possible. He waited for the dust to settle before making his next move. The dust cleared, and there was a girl standing in front of the car, left arm akimbo, a teddy bear dangling from her right hand, and a rag doll firmly secured on her back. Her face was knotted in a frown that was more curious than unfriendly. She was mere inches in front of the car. Beggy Temba saw her mouth move, but could not hear her. He switched off the engine and rolled down his window. "Who you coming to take away?" she asked, deliberately not coming any closer. What an odd question. "Who you coming to take away?" she repeated, still standing her ground. "No one," he said, flashing his most charming smile. She looked unconvinced. "Is this the place, Beaufort Farm and Estate, where the man is building an aeroplane?" he asked. Her frown became unfriendly. "I'm a reporter. I would like to do a story on this man." "Why a story?" she asked. How was he supposed to respond to that? Why a story? What else but a story? All he did was look for stories. It had never occurred to him to do anything else, to look for something else. "Well, I think the story is of interest. I think people will be inspired by the story." "Why inspired?" she asked. Another question that he could not respond to. Did she even understand what it meant to be inspired? She was probably asking questions simply to ask questions, the way most children did. "Who are you looking to inspire?" she asked. Or maybe not. Maybe she understood the conversation that they were having better than he did. "A lot of people. Many people don't believe that we can fly. Many people need to believe that we can fly." He waited for her next question, but none came. Instead, just as quickly as she had appeared, as a flash from the sunflowers, she disappeared as a flash back into the sunflowers. Beggy Temba sat in his car, not sure what to do next. A moment later, he was not quite sure if a girl had really been standing in front of his car. He had been driving for hours, and his mind had probably played a trick on him. She had been such a bright and sprightly thing. There had definitely been something otherworldly about her. Peggy Temba laughed at himself. What was he thinking? He was a man of reason. Of course the girl did exist. Should he carry on up the dirt road, or should he turn around? As he was trying to decide, he saw them, a group of people coming down the dusty road, led by the girl. She did exist. Peggy Temba got out of the car, not quite sure if he was being welcomed or not. "He says he is not here to take anyone away," the girl announced, before he could say anything. "He says he's here to tell the story of the man building the wings," she continued with authority. "He says the story will inspire people. He says people don't believe that we are capable of flight," she said, and waited for whatever would happen next. An impossibly tall man came forward. "I believe I am the man you are looking for," he said humbly. Peggy Temba doubted it. The man was painfully white. "He is my father," the girl said, her chest puffing out with unmistakable pride. She looked at the painfully white man with reverence. All those who looked at the man looked at him with reverence. Soon, Peggy Temba understood the source of their pride. Just looking at the man, Peggy Temba could tell that there was something different about him, something beyond the color of his skin. He possessed that certain something that Peggy Temba had witnessed in the dreadlocked man, power. But not just any power, power of a special kind, the power to move, inspire, and unite people, charisma. The man told Peggy Temba how he had come up with his theory of flight on September 3rd, 1978, as he watched elephants swim across the Zambezi River. What had made the first elephant cross was that it could see the other bank of the river. The elephant would not have swum into the ocean. Of this the man was certain. What made the other elephants follow was the successful passage of the first. The man wanted people to know that they were capable of flight, and at first he had erroneously thought that they would realize this if he taught them how to build aeroplanes. After watching the elephants, he understood that what was needed was merely his own belief in flight. If people saw him build a giant pair of silver wings, then they too would believe that they could fly. The Theory of Flight, Chapter 5, Justina. As Justina watched people she had known all her life move through the yellowish grey of the compound like automatons, she no longer recognized them. Something within them had changed, something fundamental. The residents of the Beaufort farm and estate compound seemed to have expended every human emotion possible and were now simply exhausted. She could not help but wonder if the scene playing out in front of her was due to the fact that the journalist, Peggy Temba Nyati, had written the story of Golide Gomede and his race of angels who believed they were capable of flight. Mr. Wundile, her adult literacy teacher, passed her by without seeing her. He carried his wife on his back. His wife's yellow and white dress was stained with a garish red. From the angle of her neck, Justina knew that Mr. Wundile's wife, Mrs. Wundile, was dead. She knew this because she had seen the heads of dead birds killed by the compound boys' slingshots hang at that angle. She herself had wrung the necks of countless chickens, so she knew intimately the angle of the neck that marked death. Mr. Wundile was not the only one carrying a dead person. Other residents were doing so too. Most helped each other carry a body. They all passed her by without seeing her. They all had a faraway look in their eyes that paradoxically seemed to be turned inward, as though they were searching for something deep within themselves, anything in the depths of their souls that would let them know what they had done to deserve this. This was having to bury family members, friends, and neighbors who, that very morning, had still been full of love, laughter, anger, greed, jealousy, resentment, something, anything, but the emptiness, the nothingness that made a body offer no resistance at all to being carried and thrown into a disused well. Whatever it was that they had felt, be it love or hatred, it had not warned them that they would be feeling it for the very last time, had not urged them to savor the moment, to hold on a little longer to the feeling. Justina watched in stupefaction as people she had known all her life helped each other pick up the body of a person she had known all her life and carry it to the disused well at the edge of the compound. Then she noticed the silence. No one was crying, no one was screaming, no one gnashed their teeth, no one stomped their feet or tore out their hair, no one ripped off their clothes. These would all have been socially acceptable forms of grieving, but no one was doing what was socially accepted. When had they learned to do this, to bury their dead in absolute silence? Could an entire community learn a lesson so quickly and so completely? There was a body that no one picked up. It was charred to brittleness beyond recognition. The hands seemed gripped by the desire to see something. The legs were twisted in a permanent dance of pain. The mouth gaped open, revealing crooked teeth. Justina thought that in life this person must have had a crooked smile. She wondered if he walked a crooked mile. She was filled with an overwhelming sadness because she could not recognize him. She had probably greeted him with Salibonani many times. He had been part of the fabric of her life, of all their lives, and here he lay, reduced to nothing. They had carried 14 bodies down the well to be buried underneath the water. Justina had counted. The crooked man's body was to be the 15th. Everyone hesitated. The crooked man seemed ready to disintegrate, and no one wanted to be the one to reduce him to further nothingness. Without saying anything, the surviving residents of the compound left the burnt remains alone and walked away. They went to their respective homes, homes that were now broken, perhaps irreparably and irrevocably. Having no other choice, Justina went home too. She entered the house through the kitchen and heard someone trying not to breathe. She turned to find Jeannie, terrified and trembling in the corner. At some point, Jeannie must have decided to run to Marcus' grandparents' house. She must have found them sitting at the table in their kitchen-cum-dining room the way Justina had left them, opposite each other with a proper tea laid out between them, good china, scones, biscuits and sandwiches. The only thing odd about the scene was that both Mr. and Mrs. Khadebe were slumped over, their heads resting on the table, which was so unlike them since they were always upright and true. They were also holding hands, which was also so unlike them since they vehemently believed that displays of affection were unchristian. Justina wondered if it was the fact that the Khadebes were slumped over so carelessly, or the fact that they were holding hands so openly, that let Jeannie know that they were dead. Mr. and Mrs. Khadebe made the final death toll 17. Poison, rat poison in the tea, Justina said in explanation as she went over to sit next to Jeannie. They made me do it, Justina whispered. They made me put it in while the Khadebes watched. Then they forced them to drink the tea, and then they just left them to die, and me to witness it. Although Justina was not crying, she was too shocked and stricken to do so. Jeannie put an arm around her. It was the adult who was supposed to comfort the child. Justina felt Jeannie was growing up before her time. She resented her having to do so. Why could those soldiers in their red berets not have left them alone? I was in the sunflower field, Jeannie said. I saw the soldiers coming. I heard the noise, the rat-a-tat, the screaming, the smell of burning flesh. When they were leaving, they stopped their army truck next to the field. One of them got out and lit a cigarette. He struck another match. I think he meant to set the field on fire. But another soldier, the one driving the truck, asked him what sunflowers had ever done to him and told him to put out the match. The other soldier did as he was told and then got back into the truck. I ran here to the Khadebes. I found this. Eventually, the adult put her arm around the child. They played Don Williams, Justina whispered, her voice trembling, as though this was the real horror of the story. They actually put Don Williams on the gramophone and then did what they did. Justina looked at Jeannie, her eyes searching. How could anyone who listens to Don Williams do such a thing? They probably did not know that we also love Don Williams, Jeannie said, sounding almost certain. If they had known, they wouldn't have done this. They wouldn't have done any of it. It almost made perfect sense. Justina looked at Jeannie with pity. Oh, they knew. They knew we loved Don Williams. They knew, and still they did this. At some point, Justina and Jeannie must have fallen asleep because a loud bang woke them up. Someone was knocking on the door. Before they could fully comprehend what was happening, the door was flung open. Justina and Jeanie shrank further into the corner. Someone shone a torch into the room. A handful of the compound's residents strode into the kitchen, but stopped short when they saw Mr. and Mrs. Kadebe slumped over the kitchen table, forever holding their peace. The torchlight swiveled and found Justina and Jeanie tucked away in the corner. "What happened here?" the torchbearer demanded. Justina was about to answer truthfully, but Jeanie rushed to say it. "It was the soldiers. They killed Mr. and Mrs. Kadebe with rat poison." There was silence. Then there was grumbling. "Is that Golide's daughter?" an angry voice inquired. "Yes," the torchbearer answered. "She needs to come out here." There was more grumbling. It sounded as if an argument was about to begin. Jeanie was about to stand up, but Justina held her down. "What do you want with the girl?" Justina asked. "Who is asking?" "Justina and Nxumalo." "You're Elizabeth's friend. You need to come out as well." The grumbling outside got louder. "None of this would have happened were it not for Golide. They were looking for him. They did this because of him," the angry voice outside called out. "But the girl has done nothing. Neither has Justina," said someone else. "They probably know where Golide and Elizabeth are. They can tell us." "Where are your parents?" the torchbearer asked. "They flew away," Jeanie said. "I told you, they ran away," the angry voice shouted. "They knew the soldiers were coming for him and they ran away and left us to... The girl needs to come out." "Do you honestly think that if they knew the soldiers were coming, they would have left their daughter behind?" "Not all parents are made the same. Some are made to leave their children behind." "It is simply not true that the soldiers came here for Golide. Things like this, like what happened here today, have been happening throughout the region for years. We all know this," a voice said, trying to reason. "Did you not hear them specifically ask for him by name? Did you not hear them shout, 'Where is Golide Gomede?' You are a liar if you say that you did not. How many of us were asked where we were hiding him? I was. If he had been here when the soldiers came, none of this would have happened. They would have taken him away and that would have been the end of that. My sons, Kumbuzo, would be alive and listening to a story around the fire right now, not in the well. This is all Golide's fault." "I think they would have done what they did anyway. They just needed an excuse to justify their actions. Golide was that excuse." "But they have been talking about unity for months now, talking about peace." "Perhaps they only did so to make us relax, to lull us into a false sense of security, to catch us unawares." "I don't care about unity. I don't care about peace. All I care about is that they asked for Golide Gomede by name," the angry voice said. "It is all because of what happened to the Vickers Viscount all those years ago. You cannot shoot down a plane and get away with it. The white man will not let you." "No white man came here today. Golide is a madman. I have been saying it for years." "But why would the soldiers come all this way to kill a madman and his followers?" "Watch what you say. My son, Skumbuzo, was no follower of Golide Gomede. I saw your son with my own eyes, touching those giant silver wings and looking at them like he had seen the glory. You are a liar if you say he was not a follower. Those we buried were all followers. All died, except a girl and Justina." There was more grumbling. The argument was becoming more heated. "Hey, you! What's this girl's name again? Funny name, difficult name, English name. You! The angry voice stuttered. "What is your name?" the torchbearer asked Jeanie. "Imogen." "Emma what?" "Imogen." "What kind of name is that?" a voice outside asked. "They've always thought they were better than us, those two. Elizabeth with her blonde wig, always singing country and western music. Golide always tinkering with that monstrosity of his and believing himself capable of flight, and giving their daughter a name fit for the Queen of England," another voice added. "You can call me Jeanie if you like," Jeanie said. There was a long silence. "Justina," the angry voice shouted. "You take this girl, Imo, this Jeanie, and the two of you go and never come back here again. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Justina said. "What about my parents when they come back?" Jeanie asked before Justina clamped a hand over her mouth. "You don't need to worry about them," the angry voice said, with uncharacteristic calmness. Jeanie obviously would have liked to say something to that, but Justina would not let her speak. torchbearer and the handful of others that had entered the kitchen left. The crowd outside also dispersed. Justina and Jeannie were left behind in the silent darkness, with only each other and the resting in peace Khadebes for company. In the very early hours of the morning, Justina stood up. She grabbed hold of Jeannie's hand. Jeannie had no choice but to stand up as well. She looked at the Khadebes, hoping that they too would stand up. "Don't look back. Never look back," Justina said, looking resolutely ahead, leading by example. She dragged Jeannie along as they exited the Khadebes' house. "What about my parents?" "People will tell them where we've gone." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere over the hills, somewhere far away from here." "Will my parents be able to find me there?" "Yes," Justina said, without looking at Jeannie. "Is that where Marcus is? Somewhere over the hills?" "Yes." "Isn't that where evil resides?" "Evil?" Justina said. "Evil has a way of finding you wherever you reside. Evil found us here today," she said, finally looking at Jeannie. "Then again, evil is everywhere, and in everyone, really. No one is inherently evil, but we are all of us capable of evil," Justina said as she looked at the charred remains of the petrified man with the crooked teeth. He was still where the compound residents had left him. "I see," Jeannie said, turning her head to look at the man. The truth was that Justina did not understand the workings of evil. She had always thought that evil was a thing that you cannot see. But now it turned out that evil could take the form of men wearing military camouflage and red berets who listened to Don Williams and had qualms about burning down sunflowers, but apparently none about making a middle-aged couple drink rat poison. If you had told me yesterday morning that by the end of the day I would have killed the Khadebes, I would have laughed at the ridiculousness of that notion. Who, after all, cuts off the hand that feeds them? And yet here I am. Here we are," Justina sighed, leading Jeannie towards the charred man. "There was a time, not so long ago, that we thought only white people capable of such hatred and anger, such evil. We know better now. We know different. Evil does not discriminate. It visits all of us with equal opportunity." Justina and Jeannie gently picked up the charred man, carefully carried him to the well, and let him free fall to its bottom. If either of them noticed that the charred man's heart had calcified into a precious and beautiful something, neither of them let on. They had already witnessed too many things that defied articulation. Justina allowed them to make one stop, the Gumedes' home. They entered the house. It had been ransacked. The sofa cushions and the mattresses had been bayoneted and gutted. Pots and pans cluttered the floor. There was broken glass everywhere because the windows had been smashed quite unnecessarily. The sight of Golide's Love More Majaivana LP collection, crushed into 1,000,000 vinyl pieces that could never be put back together again, broke Justina's heart. Golide always listened to Love More Majaivana when he was working on his Silver Wings. It was almost as if the soldiers knew that, and therefore let loose their fury on the vinyl. This was destruction simply for destruction's sake. Justina watched as Jeannie pulled down a ladder and used it to climb into the ceiling. This should have surprised Justina, but nothing could or would ever surprise her again. Jeannie re-emerged moments later, carrying in one hand a suitcase that she had obviously packed for exactly such moments in her life, and in the other, Penelope and Specs. "We should not let this change us," Justina said with authority as she took hold of Jeannie's hand again. "If we let it change us, then they will have won." As they walked past the sunflower field, Jeannie ran a hand over the closest stalks. "This is not an ending of my choosing. From now on, I will choose my own endings," she said. There was a conviction and determination in Jeannie's voice that made Justina believe her. Holding hands and watching the day breaking, Justina and Jeannie waited for the Mackenzie bus that would carry them away from the Beaufort farm and estate.